Denzel Washington thought he was making a bold statement about power, but when he suggested younger activists were more interested in microphones than missions, Jasmine Crockett gave him a lesson he didn't see coming. The studio lights were softer than usual, a low golden haze that made everything feel just a little too curated, like truth might be something you could smooth out in post. Jasmine Crockett stepped onto the stage with her usual poise, heels clicking, spine straight, nothing in her eyes but focus. She wore a charcoal blazer this time, one that said, "Business," without saying, "Don't test me." It was a Thursday night, prime time, a roundtable broadcast on one of the big three networks. The topic? Leadership, culture, civic responsibility. The kind of show where voices got raised politely and applause was cued at just the right moment. Jasmine had been here before, not this exact set, but this exact situation. A polished table, a rotating cast of public thinkers, and the quiet expectation that someone like her would either play the role of disruptor or be talked over entirely. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the energy backstage. Maybe it was the way the producers kept whispering into their earpieces. Or maybe it was the third chair, because sitting at the far end of the table, legs crossed, voice warm with practiced charm, was Denzel Washington. Yes, that Denzel. Icon elder statesman, the voice behind 1,000 viral soundbites on purpose and manhood and keeping your name clean. He smiled as Jasmine approached and stood to shake her hand. Firm grip, direct eye contact, no ego in the gesture, but a quiet gravity that filled the room. Jasmine returned the handshake, nodded politely, and took her seat. Respect, yes, but also something else. Not tension exactly, not yet. The host, a silver-haired anchor with a tone like buttered silk, welcomed viewers to the People's Roundtable, introduced each guest, praised Denzel's legacy, called Jasmine a rising political force. Jasmine just smiled. Let them set the scene however they wanted. She knew the real story always lived beneath the script. As the cameras panned wide, you could feel it. 2 generations, 2 lenses on the same struggle, one forged in Hollywood monologues and public reverence, the other built in subcommittees and soundproof panels, in rooms where grace had to be louder than fire. They were about to talk about America, but first, they'd have to decide who got to define it. They started with safe questions, softball reflections on leadership, on how community shows up when policy falls short. Denzel spoke first, voice like gravel smoothed over by wisdom. He leaned into the mic with that unshakable confidence, the kind that didn't ask for space. It assumed it was already his. "You know," he began, "my mother used to tell me, if you're not disciplined, someone else will discipline you. That stuck with me, especially now, when so many of our young people seem more focused on likes than legacy." A few audience members hummed in agreement. That deep, churchy hum. Jasmine didn't move, didn't flinch. She just listened, arms relaxed, hands in her lap, taking it all in. Not just his words, but his weight. The way he talked like his message had already been stamped and mailed, like truth was only a matter of delivery. Denzel continued, "It's not that this generation doesn't care. I believe they do, but we've traded purpose for performance. We've got people protesting without plans, shouting without strategy, and that's not power, it's chaos." The host nodded along, like a metronome set to reverence. "Powerful thoughts, Mr. Washington," he said, then turned with practiced ease. "Congresswoman Crockett, you've led protests, sponsored legislation rooted in some of these movements. What's your take?" And there it was, the pivot, the shift. The room got a little quieter, the kind of hush that creeps in when people expect a polite rebuttal or a soundbite they can clap for. Jasmine didn't jump in. She let the moment breathe, let the contrast sit. Her gaze flicked toward Denzel, not in challenge, but in calculation. Noted the way he sat back, hands folded, waiting like a man who already knew what she was going to say. She knew that weight. She'd felt it in hearing rooms and on Sunday panels, the kind of pause that asked, "Are you going to fall into the trap of proving you belong? Or are you going to take the ground without asking?" Jasmine adjusted the mic in front of her, took one slow breath, and then she spoke. Not loud, not rushed, just clear. And from the look on Denzel's face, she wasn't saying what he expected. It was subtle at first, the kind of moment that doesn't crash into a room, but slides in quietly and rewires the temperature. Denzel had just finished talking about accountability, how his generation knew how to show up without needing an audience. He sat forward now, elbows on the table, a half smile playing at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't smug, but it wasn't neutral either. "See," he said, voice smooth but firm, "the problem with a lot of these younger activists, they want a mic more than they want a mission." There it was. The line. He didn't say it to be cruel. He probably didn't even think it was cutting. But the words dropped into the center of the table like a stone in still water, and the ripples were immediate. Someone in the second row let out a quiet, that didn't sound like agreement. A producer behind the camera shifted slightly, eyes flicking to the stage manager. The host blinked once, then twice, like even he wasn't sure if it had landed the way Denzel meant. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't wince or scoff or shift in her seat. She simply locked her eyes on him, steady, focused, a single breath drawn, held, then another, watching, measuring, like she was sorting through the weight of the moment before choosing how to carry it. She'd heard worse, in back rooms, in interviews dressed as conversations, from colleagues who called themselves allies and mentors who called it tough love. But this felt different, because this was Denzel, a man who had mentored millions through monologues, who had shaped how the world imagined strength and dignity. And now, unintentionally or not, he was repeating the same note she'd spent her career pushing back against. That being seen was somehow suspect. That wanting a platform meant you didn't have purpose. And the irony wasn't lost on her, that the man who built a legacy with cameras in his face was now questioning what others did with a mic. She didn't react, not yet. But the room had changed, and the next moment would be hers. The pause was thick, not dramatic, just long enough to signal that something had shifted in the current, the kind of silence that knows it's being watched. The host looked between them, a trace of nervousness beneath his practiced calm. He tapped the side of his note card once, then turned to Jasmine with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said gently, "would you like to respond?" The camera cut to her, not in a fast, reactive way. It lingered, framed her squarely in the center. No split screen, no distraction. Just her. A breath passed, then another. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she reached for the lapel of her blazer and adjusted it slightly, a small, deliberate motion that said she was here on her own terms. She sat up just a bit straighter, shifted her weight, centered herself. It wasn't for the camera, it was for the moment. Her eyes locked briefly with the host's, then moved to Denzel, still calm, still collected, but now watching her with a mix of curiosity and caution, like a man who knew he might have said something worth rethinking, but wasn't quite ready to be told how. Jasmine leaned forward just a touch, not to invade space, but to claim hers. "I've got a response," she said quietly. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't harden, but it carried. And somehow, that carried more weight than volume ever could. The audience leaned in. Denzel did too, almost imperceptibly. She didn't launch into a retort. She didn't swing back. Instead, she placed her words down like bricks, measured, solid, building toward something real. Because this wasn't about being right. It was about being clear. And in that moment, clarity was the most dangerous thing in the room. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't blink fast or shift in her seat like someone preparing for a fight. She simply breathed, then spoke. "Respectfully, Mr. Washington, some of us didn't pick the mic." The words landed gently, but not softly. "The mic picked us," she continued, voice steady as glass, "because silence was no longer an option." The room stopped moving. A few audience members sat back in their chairs. Others leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in attention. The kind of listening people do when they know something important is unfolding and they don't want to miss a word. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her tone was measured, deliberate, like she wasn't just talking to Denzel, but to every viewer who had ever questioned why someone dared to speak without permission. "There's a danger," she said, "in assuming that visibility is vanity, that presence is ego, when in fact, for a lot of us, it's survival. Some of us are loud because we weren't heard when we whispered. Denzel's expression didn't shift dramatically, but his eyes held something new. Not resistance, not guilt, just recalibration. Like a man hearing familiar words in a language he hadn't yet learned how to listen to. Jasmine went on. It's easy to tell people how to fight when the battle's already been named for you. But there's a whole generation out here, walking into rooms built to exclude them, asked to prove they belong before they've said a single word. You call that performance. I call it protection. She paused, just long enough to let that sentence echo. I respect your legacy, she said finally, but legacy doesn't exempt us from listening, especially when the mic's been handed to someone who never asked for it. Silence. Complete. Still. Even the host didn't dare speak. The audience was still frozen in place, not out of shock, but reverence, like they'd just watched something far more precise than power. It wasn't a clapback, it was a correction. The quiet kind, the kind that redefines the rules without ever needing to raise its volume. Denzel shifted, not a lot, just a slow, thoughtful lean back in his chair. His fingers tapped the table once, then rested. A breath pulled in through the nose, the kind that buys time. I didn't mean it like that, he said. His voice was low, not defensive, but searching for the exit ramp. Not because he wanted out, but because he could feel the gravity of what he'd stepped into. Jasmine didn't pounce. She didn't interrupt or let the moment slip into awkward forgiveness. She leaned forward, only slightly, and met him where he sat. Intent, she said, doesn't erase impact. The words were soft, but they hit like thunder wrapped in velvet. She let them sit, then added, especially when your voice carries this much weight. There was no accusation in her tone, no venom, just truth, polished down to its cleanest form. Denzel held her gaze. It wasn't combat, it was communion. One person holding another accountable, not to humiliate, but to reflect, to say, you matter too much for your words to land sloppy. The audience wasn't moving. Phones were still. Even the usual background hum of shuffling or coughs had vanished. The air felt dense with attention, like a courtroom mid-verdict. I wasn't trying to question the work being done, Denzel said, slower now. I know, Jasmine cut in gently. That stopped him cold, not because she'd spoken over him, but because she'd spoken through the apology, past the safe route, into the hard truth most people avoid. You weren't trying to question the work, she said, but sometimes we say things that pull up a whole history we didn't mean to write. Another pause, another breath. Words like spicy or angry or performative, they carry a charge, especially when they're aimed at women, especially black women, especially when we finally get a mic we didn't ask for but earned. Denzel nodded slowly, not in defeat, in recognition. The room didn't breathe. This wasn't television anymore. It was a reckoning, and Jasmine wasn't just in it. She was guiding it. The clip hit social media before the studio lights even cooled. Someone in the control booth leaked the raw feed. No cuts, no commentary, just the moment Jasmine Crockett told Denzel Washington, intent doesn't erase impact. And the internet did what the internet does. It exploded. Within 30 minutes, the phrase, she didn't pick the mic picked her, was trending across X, TikTok, and Instagram Reels. Edited montages of Jasmine's expression, slow zooms on her calm delivery, side-by-side reactions of audience members blinking into stillness. One TikTok looped her full answer under a Kendrick Lamar track. Another overlaid the quote with clips of civil rights icons, crossfading from Angela Davis to Stacey Abrams. Ex-Politico baddie posted, Crockett just taught a masterclass in generational accountability. Calm, surgical, no crumbs. Activism Daily tweeted, this wasn't a clapback. This was a cultural correction. Even blue-check chaos couldn't spin fast enough. Some tried. A few armchair critics labeled her too harsh. One anonymous columnist called it performative politeness weaponized, but the replies drowned them out. She didn't yell. She didn't even flinch. It's not just what she said, it's how many of us have felt it. You could feel the air leave the room and enter ours. By midnight, Ava DuVernay had reposted the clip with a single word: grace. Kerry Washington added, "Watch this," then watch it again. Comment sections became confession booths. Educators shared how they'd show it to students. Activists said they'd quote it in upcoming workshops. Someone's aunt in Baltimore said she'd printed the transcript and taped it to the fridge. Even people who didn't know Jasmine's name the day before were now repeating her lines back to themselves like scripture, not as slogan, as strategy. Because in a culture addicted to volume, something had shifted. She hadn't raised her voice. She'd raised the bar. The applause had faded. The lights had dimmed. Crew members moved through the studio like stagehands after a storm, quiet, focused, still processing the atmosphere that hadn't quite reset. Jasmine moved through the backstage hallway with her usual poise, phone in one hand, a calm that hadn't cracked once on air. A producer offered a tight nod, eyes wide, but mouth quiet. No one asked for a selfie. Then Denzel appeared. He was standing near the dressing rooms, hands in his pockets, no entourage trailing him now. Just a man, not the icon, not the voice. He caught her eye before she reached the exit. "Congresswoman," he said, voice lower now. "Can I have a word?" Jasmine paused, tilted her head slightly, then nodded. They stepped into a quiet alcove near the wardrobe station. No cameras, no handlers. Just the buzz of a vending machine and the silence between two people who had felt the shift of something bigger than ego. Denzel spoke first. "I've done a lot of interviews," he said, "heard a lot of takes. But what you said, I'm still sitting with it." She didn't interrupt, just waited. He looked down briefly, thumb rubbing the corner of his wedding band, then back at her. "You didn't destroy me," he said. "You reminded me." That moment hung there, not as praise, but as presence. Jasmine nodded once. That was the point. Denzel chuckled, quiet and real. "You know, when you've been in this long enough, you start thinking the mic only works one way. Tonight, you flipped it, clean." She allowed the faintest smile. "Sometimes it needs flipping." He offered his hand again, not for the cameras this time. No press, no angles, just a gesture between two people who understood what it meant to carry weight when the world was watching. "Thank you," he said. Jasmine shook his hand. "Keep listening." He nodded. And for the first time all night, Denzel didn't have a line to end on, just silence and respect. The headlines had already shifted by morning, not to another scandal, but to something stranger for the internet age: reflection. News anchors didn't just replay the moment between Jasmine Crockett and Denzel Washington, they slowed it down, unpacked it. Not for outrage, but for understanding. Words like measured, grace, and intentional replaced the usual media firestorm. No one called it a takedown, they called it a shift. In a high school classroom in Charlotte, North Carolina, a civics teacher opened class with a question: "What does it mean to respond without reacting?" Then she played the clip. Jasmine's voice, low and clear, filled the room. No flashy graphics, no edits, just the weight of her tone. In a barbershop on the south side of Chicago, men paused mid-cut to debate what it means to correct without condemning. One barber said, "Back in the day, we'd call that poise." She sliced him, and he didn't even bleed until it was over. Book clubs that hadn't read a political memoir in years swapped out their next title for a transcript of the roundtable, annotated it, highlighted phrases like scripture. One woman read aloud, "Legacy doesn't exempt us from listening." And the room just nodded, silent, absorbing it. On morning radio in Mississippi, a caller, an older man, Vietnam vet, said, "I didn't know her name before this, but now I want my granddaughter to intern in her office." It wasn't just that Jasmine had spoken truth to power, it's that she had done it without breaking her shape. People weren't obsessing over a viral moment. They were studying it, repeating it, teaching it, not because it was dramatic, but because it was clear. The sun was down in Dallas, and the house was quiet except for the hum of her refrigerator. Jasmine sat at her kitchen table, no makeup, no cameras, just a glass of water beside a worn black journal. She flipped to a clean page and wrote, slow and small, "You don't always need to win the moment. Sometimes you just need to hold the mirror up. She stared at the words for a beat, then closed the book. Later that evening, she met with a group of high school students from her district, a small gathering in a multi-purpose room at a recreation center, fluorescent lights, mismatched chairs, the kind of space where real change begins, quietly. They asked about college, policy, public speaking. But one student, a girl with box braids and nervous hands, raised hers last. How do you stay calm when they come at you sideways? Jasmine didn't answer right away. She looked around the room, young faces, open eyes, the same expression she used to wear when watching people say what she didn't yet know how to. Then she smiled. Because calm isn't weakness, she said. It's control. They wrote that down. One student whispered it aloud, testing the shape of the words. The night ended without applause. No one asked for selfies. But as they left, more than one student paused in the doorway. Not to say anything, just to see her one more time. Jasmine stayed seated, watching them go. She wasn't chasing a headline. She wasn't trying to trend. She had already done what she came to do. And the impact, that part wasn't loud. It was lasting. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.